Welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast, presented by Orion Advisor Solutions and hosted by Dr. Daniel Crosby, Orion's Chief Behavioral Officer and New York Times best-selling author. Each week, Dr. Crosby interviews a fascinating new guest on a range of compelling topics, from literature to psychology to financial wellness. To learn more about Dr. Crosby's behavioral finance work at Orion, visit www.orion.com.
Hello and welcome to Standard Deviations. I am your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby, and I'm joined today by Charlotte Blank, Chief Behavioral Officer at Maritz. Charlotte has a bachelor's in neuroscience and behavioral biology from Emory, a place where I spent some time, and an MBA from a little school called Harvard. So she joins me today to discuss how to think like a scientist and to share some of her thinking around the science of motivation. Charlotte, welcome.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So I was introduced at a conference recently, and I was introduced as having a title that was more rare than being an astronaut. You know, the person that introduced me said, there's more astronauts in the world than there are chief behavioral officers. And so we've got two of them on the line today. Just real quick, what does your day-to-day look like as a chief behavioral officer? Because this is a question that I get. I know my mom has no idea what I do. So what does your role as a CBO look like?
I got to say, it's kind of a dream job for someone who has followed psychology and business all throughout my career. It's really I think the definition of the job for a chief behavioral officer is to combine the two. So my role at Maritz, which is largely speaking an incentive and rewards company, is to oversee the behavioral science practice that powers our expertise in that space. So that would include everything from research to thought leadership to application. So we turn our insights into design principles, internal programs, sometimes hands-on consulting that really just empowers our businesses to design programs that best motivate people. So in practice, that means I might be working with academics to design and implement a field experiment. I might be preparing for a talk or writing a paper or doing something to sort of demonstrate to the marketplace that Maritz is especially interested and expert in this work. Or I might be working hands-on with solution designers at Maritz on a particular client challenge.
Now, Maritz prides itself on being the most people-centric organization in the world. That's sort of the headline on the marquee. And in fact, it was one of the leaders of employee engagement for a very long time. In fact, your company now invented the now famous Gold Watch and Retirement incentive back around the Great Depression era, 1929. So what's fascinating to me is that what was positive cutting edge at the time, this idea of Gold Watch and Retirement, is now sort of this marker for, it's sort of a buggy whip now, right? It's this thing that no one gets now. No, it's like no one works for 40 years for the same place and gets a Gold Watch and Retirement. Has the science of motivating people changed over the intervening 100 years?
I'd say yes and no. I hate to make it a foregone conclusion that no one works at the same place for 40 years. Actually, at Maritz, many people do. I'm just past 6 years, but I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. But I would say the reasons for that have changed and the bar is a lot higher. So if you do see someone working at a company for 40 years, it's likely not because of inertia or because of lack of options or low expectations on the part of the employee. I think now the onus is on the companies to work even harder to keep people happy there for such a long career. The science over time, as you pointed out, Maritz has been around for over 125 years, actually, and we've been following the science that whole time. The impetus for the Gold Watch for Retirement came about in 1929 when the Great Depression hit, and Maritz was at the time a jewelry wholesaler. We were selling wristwatches when pocket watches were still all the rage. And at the Great Depression, it kind of had this inventory surplus, and Edward Maritz pivoted to a B2B model and came up with the concept of selling tangible rewards to companies to use to motivate their employees. And that practice is very much alive and well. It might be that the Gold Watch at Retirement example is sort of a quaint and niche example, but using tangible as well as experiential by way of, say, travel or incentives other ways to provide extrinsic motivation to your employees besides just paying them a salary and a cash bonus is still a very important and growing part of companies' motivation portfolio. But I'd say the way the science has changed over time, and we've kind of been following this since back then when it was about behaviorism and really just sort of a do this, get that. Picture a rat in a lab maze kind of working for a carrot versus a stick. But that's evolved throughout the 60s and 70s into more of a study of qualitative research in humanism, and where we started to look more into recognizing people for a job well done. In the 80s, self-determination theory started to come about and it only really gained popularity in the sort of popular marketplace in recent years, but this notion of intrinsic motivation and inspiring people to work for reasons that just feel good inside started to play a much bigger role in the design of these programs. And then most recently, I think what you and I are most interested with our work as Chief Behavioral Officer is the influence of behavioral economics and social psychology on human motivation programs. And I think a lot of that comes from experimentation and much more of a focus on randomized controlled trials and actually testing and learning what people do in the field versus the theoretical. So that's become a big part of my role today as well.
How accurately can people assess what motivates them? I think if you ask most people, what could your work do to get more out of you? What would motivate you at work? They would have relatively simplistic things that they would say, pay me more or whatever. And yet we see that things like gold watches or other sort of non-monetary rewards do a lot more to motivate people than simple cash. So how effectively, what level of insight do we have into what motivates us to work?
Yeah, I would say not well. People are notoriously bad at describing what motivates their own behavior. And that applies to rewards as well. So one of my favorite sort of catchphrases in all this stuff is that preference does not equal performance. And that we see a huge bias in our clients, even when we have these conversations about the power of non-cash rewards, tangible rewards, experiential rewards, other levers that you can pull besides offering more cash. There's just tons of evidence on this. And often people will come away from that feeling that it's evident, the data's there, we believe in the power of other ways to motivate, but why don't we just go ahead and give them the option? And that way everyone's happy, because if people have the choice, then they can choose cash if they want it, or something else from the portfolio if that's what they prefer. And that can be a real missed opportunity, because people do, when given the choice, people tend to default to cash because of its fungibility. It can be used for everything and anything. So people feel that it's sort of the responsible or justifiable choice to make. But we actually have data on what people do with those cash bonuses, or if it's given in the form of a card. And it tends to be on very utilitarian purchases like groceries and utility bills, things that are easily forgotten and not ascribed to the firm who provided them that reward. So the idea in sort of our whole industry is that incentives and rewards should be sort of the cherry on top, or something that's on top of your baseline table stakes compensation that inspires discretionary effort. So it should, by design, feel like something special, separate, unique, more of a treat. Yeah. But that's something that people don't tend to choose for themselves. Same reason why you don't give someone cash for their birthday. Right. That's a unique opportunity to give them something they wouldn't otherwise choose for themselves.
Right. They're going to default to the cash because it's sensible, it's prudent, it makes sense. And then they're going to spend it on, groceries and laundry detergent, and no sort of benefit accrues to the employer. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, I don't think the average person understands, just how dramatically human nature can differ from the sort of deterministic rat in a maze, sort of this for that thing that you were talking about earlier. I remember learning early in my Psych 100 classes that, a lot of times you take some, two good things, right? You take a task that people enjoy performing, you take money, which of course they enjoy, you pay them to do the task that they enjoy performing anyway, and then they rate that task as less enjoyable. So it's like, 1 + 1 = -2 sort of math. What is something that everyday folks get wrong routinely about motivation? What are some misconceptions we have about what actually drives human behavior?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would first add some nuance to that too, that while supporting intrinsic motivation is really important, money still matters.
Mm-hmm.
And so like in science and in life, it's never so black and white as whether or not cash is a good idea or not. It's always about how and when and why and for whom and in what context. So in our case, typically in a sales environment, let's say you're working on an incentive program for automotive sales consultants, when already in a hyper-transactional context, money is still relevant and still, less likely to backfire than in a situation where you're doing a favor for a friend or volunteering for a charitable exercise, and then money is introduced into the mix, especially a small amount of money that can backfire by crowding out intrinsic motivation. And that's really where a lot of that research focuses on. All of that said, that can be a common error of just like general managers, this sort of intrinsic motivation bias that we think I'm motivated by a whole host of things, and some, all kinds of different influences on me make me feel motivated, everything from money to being appreciated at work and feeling a sense of belonging. And we think more robustly about ourselves. But when we think about others and people on our team, we get lazy and think it's just all about money and just sort of default to that and don't take the time to think about the culture we're creating and whether we are supporting that sense of intrinsic motivation. So I usually think that's a good place to start is do your employees or your sales partners feel a sense of camaraderie, a tribal belonging, an opportunity to become masters of their craft and grow and get better at what they're doing. Those are all ways that people feel motivated besides money. That can really be a great place to start. I'd also say that specifically in the realm of sales, a really common mistake is to focus just on top performers and looking at who are my very best top performers and let me design recognition programs or reward programs just for them. Similarly, that can be not only just like missing an opportunity to motivate everybody else, but it can backfire by demotivating everyone else who starts to then think, well, I don't have a chance of winning that top performer prize, or I'm never going to be one of those top 5% people. So why even try? So we're big believers in focusing on moving the middle and designing programs that speak in a more custom way to not only your top people, but sort of the core as well as the laggards, the new folks. And then lastly, a biggest mistake is kind of a theme of my day-to-day, and my passion is not testing, not measuring, not thinking like a scientist. So really just kind of deferring to your sort of habit, practice, or even preference, just asking people which they prefer, but not actually testing things, trying and measuring what really works.
But you give a great example there with the sales comp example. It's a great example of how something that ostensibly seems pretty simple, we're going to have President's Club for the top 10% of our salespeople, ends up actually demotivating and introducing learned helplessness to 90% of the salespeople. Seems pretty simple. It's not that simple. So you segued into it nicely. I think I was introduced to your work through your TEDx talk, Lead Like a Scientist. What does that mean in practical terms for folks within an organization, and why is it so critical?
My thinking around Lead Like a Scientist is a call to action for leaders to take a page from marketers' playbooks who have been embracing behavioral science and applying those methods to our understanding of consumer behavior for decades. We're hardly doing that at all when it comes to motivating our own internal employees or our sales and channel partners. And it's a real missed opportunity when we spend something like 4 to 5 times the amount as a country on compensation for sales forces than we do on advertising campaigns for consumers. But this just basic practice of A/B testing and applying insights from behavioral economics, social psychology to the design of motivation programs, we're just barely scratching the surface. So the TEDx talk kind of makes the case that we're doing a lot of great work in the consumer space. Facebook, for example, is running 10,000 A/B tests a day on us. It's really sort of old hat. But when you ask a sales leader, how do you know if your program works? What have you tried and tested lately? You're usually going to be met with, we're not really sure, or this is how we've always done it. So there's a really great opportunity to start running experiments and learning about what works best when it comes to motivation.
I think for the average business person, the idea of an RCT, right, of a randomized controlled trial invokes images of people with beakers and white lab coats, and maybe they wouldn't even know where to get started. And yet, as you say, Facebook's running 10,000 of these a day. What's an example of an easy randomized control trial that a business could conduct on the cheap, on the easy, that wouldn't take someone like one of us to sort of oversee?
Easy place to get started is usually in something in the communications realm, like how something is framed up. Most email providers and even some website plugins make it easy to run A/B tests so that you can get some controlled insights on what at least engages people or can serve as sort of a proximal indicator for something that you care about down the road, like purchase activity. So often an easy place to get started is an A/B test that doesn't really change the foundation of the program you're running, but maybe adjusts how it's framed up. So maybe in one condition, you test out a behavioral insight like social proof or anchoring, and compare that to a control group without that sort of messaging. And that might give you a sense of an idea that could be further tested with something more structural down the road.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of my favorites, I think I've talked about it on the show before, but Dan Egan, who's the head of behavioral finance at Betterment, they were proactively sending out messages to folks on days when the market was volatile, right? So they would sort of blast out messages to people when the market was having a rough day, saying, hey, stay the course, don't panic, don't worry about it. But what they found when they A/B tested it and they had a control group that they didn't send was that people actually misbehaved more. People did more with their portfolios when they were alerted via these messages, because the preponderance of their clients were not checking and weren't even watching the markets and weren't worried. Oh. So they were actually introducing a level of concern when they were seeking to introduce a level of calm. And so it's one of those things where it's like, that sounds like a solid idea, right? Like, we'll send out a message and give you data points that say, hey, you should stay the course, you shouldn't overtrade your portfolio, you should be long-term. Well, when really what you did was a lot of those people were already long-term in their thinking. They didn't even know the market had a bad day, and you'd introduce worry where there was none previously. So it all needs to be tested. Everyone's got a favorite work project. What's your favorite randomized control trial that you've ever overseen in your career?
My favorite RCT we've done so far at Maritz is with one of our automotive partners, who we call Carco in the paper. They, like for many clients, sort of a typical program we run is called a channel incentive or a stair-step program that motivates at the dealership level them to hit certain volume targets per month. And we administer the design and implementation of that program, including paying out these substantial cash bonuses at the end of each month. And the idea actually came from the client. The head of sales for Carco had this idea of what would happen if we could pay the dealerships upfront at the beginning of the month instead of at the end, based retrospectively on how they did that month. If we could pay them upfront at the beginning and say, this is yours to keep or lose. If you hit your sales target, you keep this payout. And if you miss your target this month, we'll claw it back from you. We'll actually take it back. We'll debit your account. So that notion of a clawback incentive is a really interesting one. It hadn't been tested in this context before, but you'll recognize is really based on this well-studied, robust concept of loss aversion or relatedly, the endowment effect that we know. And there are like 3 Nobel Prizes related to this. We know with a lot of evidence that people tend to value something more that they have. It hurts worse to lose that thing that you already have then it feels good to potentially gain that thing later. So what we don't know as much about is how that effect translates into effort and how hard people will work to do something. And more interestingly, we don't really know anything about whether this would have an effect on a firm, because this program is paid out at the dealership level across a network of about 1,500 dealerships, not at the individual salesperson level. Yeah. So you could just as easily argue that, a dealership should have a functioning finance department that knows how to handle advanced funds responsibly, set them aside, earn interest on them, whatever, and it may not have any effect on their sales performance at all. So that's what made it really interesting to us to test. And we brought in some of our academic partners, economists. Lamar Pierce at WashU is our main partner here. And I still give huge credit and kudos to the client for enabling us to run a proper randomized controlled trial. And we sort of walked into this idea and came out with what ended up being one of the largest RCTs ever conducted in a sort of a corporate context. And what we did was over 300 dealerships. We matched them to be otherwise identical in every way. So before the experiment, these two groups of A and B looked exactly the same in terms of their sales. And we randomized them. And over the course of 4 months, had one group serve as the control, business as usual, got paid at the end of the month like always. But the treatment group received this advanced funds with a clawback provision. So they got paid up upfront at the beginning of the month. And if they missed their sales, we debited their parts account and got that money back. And what we found was really interesting. So short story is effectively the loss contracts backfired by making sales go down. So actually over this period of time in the treatment group, sales go up about 2% over this 4-month period, which is important to note because it shows the importance of the control group. Having looked at the control group where sales are going up 6% over that period of time, we're able to clearly see that you need to observe both. You need this difference in order to detect the effect at all. Right. And this is like so important to our work as chief behavioral officers going forward. I probably use this slide almost every day to make this point that when we say test or experiment, we don't mean just try it out and see what happens pre-post. Because if we did that, we would think, oh, sales went up 2%. That's pretty great. That works out to a tremendous amount of money in the auto industry. But thankfully, we have a proper control group so we can see what would have happened if we hadn't touched this at all. And the answer is that actually this really hurt sales. So I'd say that right there was tremendously useful for the practitioners, for the client who just wants to know, I have this kind of cool idea. I have reason to believe it might work. I want to know for sure whether it works or not. You can try it in a real world context that limits your risk to a portion of dealers. And then you'll know for sure whether it works and you can move on to the next idea if it doesn't work. And that's effectively what they got out of this. So now the next time that idea comes up, they'll know to proceed with caution or to know when and when to use it. But for us, what makes it so interesting is why we saw that surprising effect. Why did it make sales go down when loss aversion might predict that, hey, people are going to have this extra threat of losses that should make them work even harder to sell even more. And that the reason why is what makes this, I think, a novel contribution to the study of motivation. And it was that it depends what happens when dealers are extra focused on their targets, because our evidence shows that consistent with prospect theory, the loss contracts do make dealers hyper focused on their targets. Like for the dealers who were a little shy of the targets before, this intervention definitely shoved them over the hump. They got there. And it was because they were really, really focused on that target. But the interesting thing is dealers have kind of two mechanisms they can turn to hit these volume targets. One is to put more effort into selling as hard as they can. The other is to multitask, or what we call gaming in the incentive industry. So dealers do things like perfectly legal behavior, but just working to optimize the rules of the system that they're in, which is not always consistent with the long-term best interests of the organization. And in this case, they were gaming between two different groups of vehicles that they could sell at the dealership. one is more profitable and easier to sell than the other. And we found that for dealers, when we put this extra heat on them and they got extra concerned about the target, they started to do even more of that gaming behavior. And they really sort of abandoned one of those model groups to focus on the easier one to sell, just to make extra sure they were hitting that target. So essentially, that was the novel kind of contribution that we found, that that lost contracts can backfire when there's opportunity to game the system, because you'll start to see more of that. So that's kind of the idea, and it's my favorite example because of the practicality of what the client was able to learn from that, but also it's just a very Maritz-y example. That's kind of the space we play in, and our particular expertise is in channel sales and motivation. So for us to come up with these new generalizable insights about incentive design is really kind of my focus going forward.
Yeah, that's an incredible study. I think we'll be looking forward to that 4th Nobel Prize coming out very soon. That's a fascinating study. And I mean, it reminds me of some of the various types of psychology for which there's an inverted U curve, right? Something like stress and performance, right? So, a little stress, you perform poorly, and then lots of stress, you perform poorly. It's not a matter of more is more. And I think psychology and human behavior are a mix of art and science. With that in mind, are there things that just defy examination? Like, are you willing to concede that there are parts of the human experience that defy examination, or are you such a hardcore scientist that you think it can all be operationalized?
That is such an interesting question. I mean, we're starting from such a low bar in business that it's hard to come up with an example in a sales context that wouldn't benefit from a little more data. But this does make me think of, and I hope I'm not skirting the question, but it's something that comes up a lot that it just annoys me, first of all, but I think it's kind of related to this. And it's an expectation of behavioral science to be able to productize these insights in a certain way that turns it into like an algorithm that could predict, here's based on all the literature in behavioral economics, we now know that if you were to flip a switch and add some element of whatever it is, social proof or anchoring or loss aversion, if you could add this thing to this program, you could expect 50% lift in sales. Some kind of prediction model. I've been asked for that a few times, and it seems like it's impossible. Like that just sort of misses the nuance of these things, and the fact that we have so much more to learn in real world contexts and places where the effect sizes vary so much, or even the direction of the effect, like when things backfire, like the example I just shared. So I think that would be something I'd offer, that it's really got to be, we have to have the patience to just keep saying, we don't really know, and it depends. And there's, these huge things that still need to be tested before we make these sort of like sweeping predictions.
Yeah, I think that's one of the misattributions or misconceptions people have most consistently about work like ours. I get asked all the time for sort of deterministic predictions, or like, sort of more colloquially, like, what am I thinking? Or, what am I going to do next? And, it's like, it's not quite that easy. In this same vein, and I guess the final sort of formal question is, what are the lessons of the replication crisis? Because we sort of as a discipline are going through this replication crisis, where it's coming to light that perhaps some of this seminal and foundational work in psychology was not done with adequate rigor or oversight. Some of our key findings are having difficulty replicating. On the one hand, we know that we need to be more scientific in our thinking. We need to be running these RCTs within our organizations. But the ability to get the wrong result or to sort of misapprehend something, it's pretty easy to do. So what for you are the lessons of the replication crisis?
For me, the lesson is that context is everything, and that real world environments are so messy that, again, the example I just shared, that even if something does replicate in the lab, it probably won't in the wild. Like we are going to find way more examples as we continue to test and replicate things from one context to another. Even if it seems like a really similar context, there's going to be surprises and things that don't work out the way we expect. And I think the faster we accept that, the better. And I've heard this phrase or concept that behavioral science is a verb, not a noun. Like it's really about embracing the methodology, and that when we talk about behavioral science or behavioral insight, we should be, that's almost synonymous with the practice of running experiments, the practice of defining a testable or answerable question versus just like coming up with an easy answer up front. Like, well, based on the textbooks, based on this or that bias or heuristic, we can expect X or Y. The odds of that working out as we expect are just so slim. And I think the replication crisis kind of speaks to that it's just, we need to keep testing everything in each context before assuming we know how it'll turn out.
Yeah, one of my fears with the replication crisis is that the baby will get thrown out with the bathwater, that people will become so nihilistic and so skeptical of doing research on human behavior that people will just kind of throw their hands up and say, what's the point? None of it replicates anyway. And I don't think it's that black and white. And so I'm grateful for thoughtful practitioners like yourself who know that we should work towards greater humility and greater nuance, but that it's still worth doing. And I think that it's been sort of my observation that some of the old studies are now there are attempts being made to debunk old research that are as hasty and breathless, perhaps, as some of the original research was. And, we're sort of recreating a problem. We've gone from one problem to another. So just because it's hard to do and it's nuanced doesn't mean it's not worth doing, I think.
I agree. Yeah, there's sort of a gotcha culture.
Yeah.
It feels like, like you're trying to disprove everything before you.
Definitely. So, well, this would normally be the part of the podcast where I, ask you some sort of fun, lighthearted questions. You're in St. Louis. I am a huge St. Louis Cardinals fan, despite the fact that I'm wearing a Braves hat now because I'm going to work out after this. And I would never dirty a Cardinals hat with sweat. But you were you're not a huge sports fan, so that we had to go a different direction, which is fine. But I just want you to know that you live in the home of the world's greatest baseball team, and I hope you'll take advantage of that. What's your favorite part of living in St. Louis?
Oh gosh, I think St. Louis is a really cool town. And I got to say, I'm not a huge sports fan, but I will say Steve Maritz, our chairman, is a part owner of the Blues. And so last year, being in St. Louis, or is it 2 years now with the pandemic black hole, being in St. Louis at the time of winning the Stanley Cup and just the way that all happened, and to be kind of swept up in that, and to see the town just blanketed in colors and just the hometown pride. I felt so honored to kind of get to experience that and be a part of it. I also got to take a sip of whiskey out of the cup because Steve brought it by party on campus. So I got a really good St. Louis experience. But I would say one of the coolest things about St. Louis is the food culture, incredible restaurants. I mean, we just never run out of really awesome, authentic restaurants to try. And if anybody's new here or, hasn't been yet, I would say you got to check out Forest Park. That's what made me move here. I was in Detroit before. Maritz has a big office in Detroit because of our auto business. So I could have stayed there, but then it was maybe it's time to move to headquarters. And it was I happened to stay over for this perfect weather, early October kind of time of year, and just sat in Forest Park and read a book and was I could live here. So, so we live right across from the park now, right by WashU. And it's a wonderful place to raise a family.
Yeah. Forest Park, Central West End. It's not all toasted ravioli and custard, even though those things
those are both must tries as well.
Yeah, those are delicious as well. And the City Museum is really, really neat. The City Museum is really one of a kind. Totally. I'm excited take my kids there in happier, healthier times. So, well, you have been an incredible resource to our listeners. Thank you so much for coming and share your expertise here. If people want to watch the TED Talk, if they want to follow some of your work, where can you be found online?
Yeah, I would. I'm on Twitter as @CharlotteBlank. I would also recommend peoplescience.com, which is our thought leadership platform about behavioral insights in the modern marketplace. It's all written kind of to be funny, shareable, interesting content. So check out People Science.
Okay, People Science, and go watch the TED Talk. Thanks so much, Charlotte.
Thanks, Daniel. Talk to you soon.
Thanks for tuning in to Standard Deviations. If you can't wait till next week for more behavioral finance insights, visit www.orion.com. All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by Orion and its affiliates, subsidiaries, and employees. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information the participants consider reliable.